Have you ever heard the tales of the Wild West? Cowboys, gold rushes, and brave pioneers settling a vast, empty land? It's a powerful story, a core part of American identity. But what if I told you that land wasn't empty? What if the story we've all been told is missing its most crucial and tragic chapter? Today, we are pulling back the curtain on westward expansion to uncover the devastating conflicts it ignited with the native nations who had called this continent home for millennia. This isn't just a story of cowboys and settlers. It's a story of broken treaties, cultural clashes, and a fight for survival. Let's travel back to the early 19th century. The United States, a young and ambitious nation, is bursting at the seams. Leaders and citizens alike are captivated by an idea called manifest destiny. This was the widely held belief that it was America's divine mission, its destiny, to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. It was a powerful, driving ideology. On paintings and in speeches, it was portrayed as a noble quest, bringing light and civilization into the wilderness. But for the hundreds of sovereign native nations living in that wilderness, the Cherokee, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Apache, and so many others, this destiny spelled disaster. Their lands, their resources, and their very way of life stood directly in the path of this relentless expansion. The stage was set for a century of conflict. One of the earliest and most heartbreaking examples was the Trail of Tears. In the southeast, the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, had made incredible efforts to coexist. The Cherokee, for instance, created a written language, adopted a constitution modeled on the U.S., and owned successful farms. They assimilated, hoping to prove they could live alongside their new neighbors. But their land was rich with cotton, and after a gold rush in Georgia, incredibly valuable. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson, a man who built his career on fighting Native Americans, signed the Indian Removal Act. This law gave the federal government the power to force native nations off their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee Nation fought back, not with weapons, but with the law. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, and incredibly, they won. In Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the state of Georgia had no authority over the Cherokee Nation. But President Jackson famously defied the court's decision. He allegedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. I'll let him enforce it." The result was the forced march of over 16,000 Cherokee people, over 1,000 miles, to what is now Oklahoma. They were herded into stockades, given little food, and forced to walk through the dead of winter. Over 4,000 men, women, and children died from disease, starvation, and exposure. This wasn't a battle. It was a state-sponsored death march, forever known as the Trail of Tears. It sent a clear and brutal message. No amount of assimilation, no legal victory, could protect native lands from American greed. As settlers pushed further west, the pattern of conflict intensified on the Great Plains. The heart of this new battleground was the bison, or buffalo. For plains tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, the bison was everything. It was their source of food, shelter, clothing, tools, and spiritual significance. Their entire culture revolved around the great herds. American expansionists knew this. They saw the bison as an obstacle, and more sinisterly as a tool of war. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad cut the massive bison herds in two, disrupting their migration patterns. But it was the U.S. government's policy that was truly devastating. To subdue the Plains tribes and force them onto reservations, the government actively encouraged the mass slaughter of bison. Army commanders like Philip Sheridan said, "Let them kill, skin and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Professional hunters, armed with powerful rifles, could kill hundreds of bison a day, often taking only the hide and tongue and leaving the rest of the carcass to rot. Between 1870 and 1875 alone, an estimated 25 million bisons were killed. The plains were littered with bones. For the native nations, this was not just the loss of their primary resource. It was the deliberate destruction of their world. Without the bison, they faced starvation, and their ability to resist American encroachment crumbled. This destruction of their way of life led directly to some of the most famous conflicts in American history, often called the Plains Indian Wars. These weren't isolated skirmishes. They were a prolonged, desperate fight for survival. Think of Red Cloud's War in the 1860s, where Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors successfully fought the U.S. Army to a standstill. Forcing the government to abandon its forts along the Bozeman Trail, it was a rare victory for the tribes, resulting in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, which promised the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills in perpetuity. Perpetuity, however, turned out to be very short-lived. Just a few years later, gold was discovered in the Black Hills, a sacred place for the Lakota. Thousands of white miners illegally flooded the area, and the U.S. government, rather than honoring the treaty, tried to force the Lakota to sell their sacred land. When leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused, the army was sent in to force them onto reservations. This led to the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Also known as Custer's Last Stand, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a flamboyant and overconfident officer, led his 7th Cavalry into a massive encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. Underestimating his enemy, Custer attacked. He and his entire immediate command were wiped out. While it was a stunning military victory for the tribes, it was a hollow one. The massacre of Custer and his men outraged the American public and fueled a desire for revenge. The U.S. Army redoubled its efforts, relentlessly pursuing the tribes, destroying their camps, and forcing them to surrender. The victory at Little Bighorn only sealed their fate. The era of free-roaming plains tribes was over. The final, tragic bookend to this century of conflict came in 1890 at a place called Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. By this time, most of the Lakota were confined to reservations, living in poverty and despair. A new spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance swept through the tribes. It was a peaceful religious revival, prophesying that if they danced and prayed, the white settlers would disappear and the bison would return. It offered a desperate glimmer of hope. But U.S. authorities saw it as a threat, a precursor to an uprising. On December 29th, the 7th Cavalry Custer's old regiment surrounded a band of Miniconjou Lakota led by Chief Spotted Elk, who was traveling to the Pine Ridge Agency to seek peace. The soldiers began to disarm the Lakota warriors. A shot rang out, no one knows from which side and. The soldiers opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns, devastating machine guns of their day. Many were shot while trying to flee. The bodies of women and children were found miles away from the camp. Wounded Knee wasn't a battle. It was a massacre of largely unarmed people. It marked the definitive end of the Indian Wars. The resistance was broken. From the Trail of Tears to the slaughter of the bison, from the broken treaty over the Black Hills to the massacre at Wounded Knee, the story of westward expansion is inseparable from the conflicts it created. It was a clash not just over land, but over entire worldviews. The American vision of private property, manifest destiny, and resource extraction was fundamentally incompatible with the native nation's communal relationship with the land and their way of life. The government's policies forced removal. Broken treaties, cultural destruction, and military violence were not unfortunate side effects of expansion. They were the very tools used to achieve it. Understanding this history is crucial. It challenges the romantic myths of the Old West and forces us to confront the true cost of America's growth. A cost paid in land, in lives, and in a cultural heritage that was nearly extinguished. The echoes of these conflicts still resonate today in the struggles that Native communities face for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural preservation. Thank you so much for watching. This is a complex and painful part of history, and it's vital that we don't forget it. If you found this video informative, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into our shared past. Let us know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to see covered. See you next time.